Hi, I'm Lorne Bregitzer, the audio professor with Secrets of Recording, and I'm going to show you how to create a radio effect in Ableton Live. Now, this radio effect, you can modulate with just one knob. So you can turn it up and crank up the radio effect and turn it back down and modulate that and automate that if you want. So it sounds something like this. So I have this one knob down here that I can modulate. So let me just mute that track and go back to one without the effect on there and show you how I'm going to do it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to kind of create that effect. So there's the dry effect. So first thing I'm going to add is an EQ. So I'm going to use the EQ8. I'm going to drop it down here. And what I'm going to do is add a high pass filter as steep as it goes, this X4 here, and then do the same thing with a low pass filter. So I'm going to switch this to a low pass filter 4X as well. So now I'm going to adjust, I usually remember the number 3 when I'm trying to create a radio effect, which means about 300 hertz. So I'm going to turn that up to about 300 hertz or so. And then I'm going to bring one down, maybe about anywhere between 3,000 and 3.5K. So somewhere like 3.3K is fine. And then the other thing I'm going to do is add a little bit of resonance just above that. And I can tighten it up as well if I wanted to. So I can make it a little tighter, a little resonance. It's going to sound something like this. Turn it off. Okay, so that sounds pretty good. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to I'm going to compress that a little bit. So I'm going to go into my dynamics. I'm going to grab the compressor here and drop that on there. And I'm just going to kind of crank up the compression a little bit. Fairly quick attack and just kind of squish it. I'm going to adjust the output gain. That makes it a little more consistent. And so the third thing I'm going to do is add a speaker to it. So I'm going to use, and this comes with the Ableton Live Suite, I'm going to use this cabinet. So it comes with the amp, but I'm just using the cabinet because it emulates just a speaker. So I'm going to use the smallest one, which is this default 1x12 speaker. On-axis condenser is fine. I'm going to change the output to stereo, though, because otherwise it's just mono. So I'm going to have a stereo output. And the last I'm going to add is I'm going to add the pedal distortion to that. So I'm going to grab the pedal and drop it just before the cabinet. So it's going to be between the compressor and the cabinet because I want the distortion to occur before any sort of coloration of the cabinet. So I'm going to use just the regular overdrive setting, maybe keep the gain about 50%, and hear how it sounds. So obviously that's too much. So I'm going to bring the dry wet down to maybe about 30-ish or so. Okay, so that sounds great. So what I'm going to do now is put that all into an effects rack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the first device and the last device, and on an Apple I can choose Command G. Otherwise I can go to Edit and select Group. And that puts into an effects rack here. So I'm going to open up my macros here. I'm in Ableton Live 11, so I have up to 16, but I'm looking to use one. So what I'm going to do is I want to assign all of these functions that I've added to this first knob. So most of these are pretty easy. For the cabinet, I can just right-click and say Map to Macro 1, and it'll map that to Macro 1 over here. I'm going to do the same thing with the compressor. I'm going to go map that to Macro 1, which is renamed Dry Wet. So that's going to be mapped there. So when I bring that knob up and down, you can see it's affecting those two dry wet knobs. Now, we don't have a dry wet knob on the EQ, so we're going to have to do a little bit of adjustments on the bands. But what I'm going to do is with this pedal, I want to go not from 0 to 100 like I have with the compressor and the cabinet. I want to go from 0 to 30%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to map that to that same macro. But now you can see it goes from 0 to 100%. So what I want to do is I click on Map in the macros here, and I can adjust the range of that pedal. So you can see the dry wet on that pedal over here, 0 to 100%. I'm going to say 0 to 30%. Hit Enter there. And now when I turn that map off, when I bring that knob down, you can see that percentage on the pedal goes from 0 to 30, while all the other two knobs are going from 0 to 100, which is exactly what I want. I want to adjust that range on there. Okay, so now I want to do the same thing to the EQ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this band here, And this frequency, this 300 hertz, I'm going to right click and map that to that same macro. And I want it to go up to 300. So I got to remember 300 hertz. So I'm going to map that to macro 1, which has now been renamed macro 1. So it's not just a dry wet knob. I'm going to go back to my map here, and I'm going to adjust that range. So again, as it sits now, I bring it up and down. It's going to span the whole range of that EQ. I just want it to go from the lowest, which is 10 hertz, to about 300 hertz. So I'm going to just type in 300. And so now that range, when I bring it up, that macro, you can see all the way up, it goes to 300. So I need to do the same thing, but I need to reverse it for this high frequency. This high frequency at 3.3 kilohertz. What I'm going to do is map that same frequency to macro 1. So you can see it shows up here. But a couple of different ways to do this. I can either go in and just bring this 22K to the bottom, or I can just right click and select invert range, and it's going to have the bottom be 22 kilohertz and the top be 10 hertz. So what I want it to do is bring that up, and I want it to drop down to 300 hertz. So I'm going to adjust this from 22 kilohertz at the top knob. I want it to drop down to 3,300 hertz. So now when I bring that knob down, you can see it's bringing those two EQ bands in together. And so the last one is this little resonant boost I have. I have it being boosted about 3K or 3 dB, I should say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that gain, I'm going to map that to macro 1 again, and I'm going to adjust the range of that. So on the bottom, I want it to be 0. At the top, maybe I'll make it a little more, maybe go up to about 4 dB or so. The nice thing is having these macros mapped this way, you can adjust and fine tune these parameters if you want to make adjustments to the way the radio effect sounds. So now I'm going to unclick map. And so now when I bring this macro up, you'll hear the radio effect ease in and out. Now, another thing you can do is if the volume gets a little bit too low when you have that macro on, I can go and grab the utility, drop that at the end of this effects rack here, and I can map that output to macro 1. Again, I'm going to go into the mapping of it, and I'm going to set the gain to go from 0 to maybe just a couple dB louder, just like 2. So it raises the decibels of that utility device. So now I bring that up. You can see that gain rise a little bit. So now when I play it back, and there you have it. So I can right click. I'm going to rename this. Let's call it radio dry wet. And then in Ableton Live 11, I can now just eliminate some of those macro knobs I don't want to see and just have one big knob that I can automate. I'm going to hide these racks there. And so I just have one knob to do all that. And for further fun, what you can do is I can go in, I can take an LFO and drag that before that audio effects rack, and I can map a sine wave. So now what you can do is you can take an LFO, drop it on there, and I can then map this sine wave to this percentage, so I can set it to be like every 2 bars to cycle through that. Set it to 2 bars and map it to that macro. I wanted to start without effect off, so I'm going to adjust the phase to 50 on there, and now let's hit play. So there you have it, a quick and easy way to create a radio effect in Ableton Live and to create your own effects rack that'll have one knob that you can control it all.